Hey guys, last time we talked about how matter cycles through the food chain. So we talked about first how energy cycles through the food chain, or through the food chain, and how it is converted from one form, from light energy to chemical energy to kinetic energy, um, and how at every step, every time it's converted, energy is lost. Then we talked about matter and how matter is recycled, and how carbon stays carbon. Sometimes it's attached to oxygen, and sometimes it's attached to other carbons, and sometimes it's attached to hydrogens. But it always remains carbon. It gets recycled over and over and over again. We don't get any new carbon, so it doesn't get destroyed. Today we're going to talk about how bioaccumulation occurs in a food chain. And so we're going to talk about how matter is passed down the food chain, and how sometimes things can go wrong if something is not working correctly in the passing on of materials. So first, let's think about what happens when we eat our food. When we eat our food, the food gets broken down into very small pieces. So here we have a piece of pizza, and it's going to get broken down. It goes down her esophagus, into her stomach, and then it goes from her stomach into her small intestines. And so in her stomach, there is gastric acid, which is going to chemically break down the food into smaller pieces. And then it's going to be secreted into her small intestines, where bacteria and other enzymes are going to break the food down even smaller. It's going to be broken down into its constituent parts, or the smallest pieces possible. So it's going to start as pizza, and it's going to get broken down into our nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. It has to be broken down into those very small pieces in order for it to pass through the walls of the small intestines. After the food passes through the walls of the small intestines into the bloodstream, you guys know that our blood goes everywhere. All of those little pieces of food, or all of those nutrients now, go throughout the whole body and is delivered to every cell so that they can have the pieces that they need in order to function. So then, this is how things are supposed to work. When your food is done in the small intestines, it gets passed into the large intestines. Water is then taken out of the food, and it becomes like what we think of when we think of poop. So before that, it's very watery, and then as it sits in the intestines, it becomes excrement, and it passes through the bowels. So bioaccumulation is something that occurs when something that you eat can't be broken down. When there's something that you eat that can't be broken down, we call it a persistent toxin. These are called persistent toxins. And these are just a bunch of the persistent toxins that we find in our food chain right now. You don't need to know these. Ones that are going to show up in this lesson are going to be PCBs. We're going to talk about PCBs. DDT is an important one that we will talk about within a few classes. But there's also heavy metals like lead and mercury. Those are already broken down to its smallest piece. Those are atoms or elements, and they're not going to be broken down into smaller pieces, but they're not good for us, and they stay in our system and we can't get rid of them. So what happens, let me move this picture. What happens, because they can't be broken down into smaller pieces, into nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, the pizza remains pizza, or the mercury remains mercury, or the PCB stays as PCB, which is a toxin. At very small amounts, it's not going to hurt you. But when it builds up, when you get more into your system, it starts to have a greater negative impact. And so here in the seawater, because of pollutants, and we'll talk about how they get there later, different pollutants that we find in our water, we can see how it gets passed on to the phytoplankton, or plant plankton. And then the little blue circle here in the phytoplankton gets passed on to the zooplankton or the animal plankton. And then this little blue circle or the persistent toxin gets passed on to the sea star when it eats it. So as you can see, it's not going away. It just gets passed on down the food chain because nothing can break it down. It stays. It's persistent. If the persistent toxin is consumed by a small fish, so here we have a small fish, and it's going to have just a small amount of this persistent toxin. In this case, we're talking about mercury, but we could be talking about PCBs or DDT. So it'll have just a small amount, and then the big fish is going to eat the little fish. And so that persistent chemical is going to be passed on to the big fish. But that big fish isn't going to eat just one little fish in its lifetime. It's going to eat hundreds of these little fish. And so then this big fish has hundreds of the toxin. Now we have an even bigger fish. And this even bigger fish is going to eat this big fish. And it's not just going to eat one of the big fish, it's going to eat tens of the big fish. And so now it has tens of hundreds or thousands of the toxin. And remember that as the amount of toxin builds up in a system, the negative effects of it are going to increase. So with mercury, if you have lots of mercury in your system, you're going to have your brain isn't going to function correctly, and you can have kidney disease. If you have lead in your system, that's really not good. Also, it affects your intellectual abilities. It can affect your bladder, and basically lead affects everything negatively. So you definitely don't want to eat lead. But so as you can see, as the toxin builds, so it's going to build even more into the even bigger fish. In the even bigger fish, it's going to have even more. But if you don't have an undying love for fish, then who cares, right? But what about us? This fisherman is fishing for this fish. And he's going to eat this fish. And he's not going to just have one tuna in his entire life or one even bigger fish. He's going to have many of them. And so over a lifetime, he's going to have a buildup of these toxins in his own system. And he's going to feel the negative impacts of these toxins. And so bioaccumulation, also known as biomagnification, kind of the same thing, so you might hear them interchangeably. Bioaccumulation is the buildup of toxins at the top of the food chain. So it's here. These smaller fish are not very affected, but as you move up the food chain, you can see these blue dots are getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the amount of the toxin builds up in the system. And here, this is where we're seeing the negative consequences. When you live for 60 to 100 years and you eat many, many fish, you're acquiring lots of toxins over a lifetime. And this is because we don't break them down. They are persistent chemicals. Okay, I hope that makes sense, and I will see you guys next time.